All right. Hi and welcome, everybody. So, thank you so much for taking the time for joining us today. We have a QA function at the bottom. So, if you have any questions as they come up, definitely lock those in there and we'll get to those after the presentation. And in the meantime, feel free to open up the chat, introduce yourselves, let us know where you're from. Make sure it's set to attendees and all panelists so that way everyone can see you. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks, Braden. All right. So today we're going to be talking about how to structure a conversational product team. And welcome to today's session. So as you guys know, these are events that are hosted by Voiceflow. We make it easy for people to design, prototype, and build voice apps with little to no code, with the goal of ultimately letting anybody be able to prototype and get their teams supercharged in terms of how fast that they can build voice applications. Ultimately with the goal of democratizing conversation design and development for everyone. In the series, we do a bunch of different things from covering interviewing and connecting people with thought leaders, highlighting creators and their stories, and connecting business minds and futurists, ultimately so we can grow with our community. So let's get started. For those of you who don't know me, I am Emily. I'm the head of growth at Voiceflow. I'll be moderating the chat today. And I'm super excited to introduce Braden, who's going to be the host for today. Braden, can you give us a quick little hello?
Hey everyone, thanks for coming today. It should be a pretty informative talk, I hope. And yeah, excited to get started.
All right, so with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Braden.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yep, you're good.
Alrighty. So this is how to structure a conversational product team. So this is sort of a larger team than what you would typically see with just sort of a conversation design team. There's lots of different names, whether it's a UX team, just a normal product team. But for the sake of this talk, we're just saying it's conversational product teams, how to structure them, and all that. So we've already gone over that. Today we're going to be covering a couple different topics. So CX product team workflows is going to be a big one because of course it's not only how you structure the team, but how does the team work together. The actual roles of the CX product team, challenges that we've seen CX product teams face, and sort of the future of what a lot of this is going to look like. I've got a lot of content here. I've given this talk a few times before. I actually went ahead and I've added some slides, and so if you see different styles and things like that that are a little inconsistent, just know that it's a couple of presentations pulled together because I think there's a lot of great stuff in here. So let's dive right in. Why CXP teams are being centralized in the first place. This is always a really important topic because it's really important to understand why we're seeing conversational product teams actually emerge. And how this has come about is generally platform shifts. So this is sort of the way that we interact with mainstream technology. This shifts, a couple times a generation. So you can remember when personal computing first came out, we had when mobile first came out, and recently I think conversational AI is becoming the new mainstream platform. And it's important to distinguish between the platform and the interface. And so, a great example of this would be back when personal computing first came out, it didn't have a graphic interface, it had a command line interface. And then what happened was once that platform shifted, we had the personal computer, then we had an interface shift that followed, and we went from the command line to the GUI interface, the graphic interface. Then we had mobile phones come out, and if you guys all remember, the first smartphones had keyboards. I've got a soft spot being Canadian, and so if you remember the Blackberries before the iPhone, that was all the rage. And then we had an interface shift as we went from the keyboard to the touchscreen. And I believe more recently with conversational AI, we had these first sort of bots emerge as chatbots, and more recently, we're starting to see an interface shift from chat to voice. Now, in most of these cases, both interfaces are going to persist. So there's going to be both chat and voice, same as there's both keyboards and touch, and same as there's both command line and graphic interface. However, every time there's an interface shift, it generally just unlocks a variety of new use cases that we need to be able to design for and account for. And so each of these shifts generally requires a new wave of creative software and processes. And what this means for businesses is that they have to automate over an increasing number of channels. So it's not just IVR systems, it's not just SMS, not just web chat, it's not Facebook Messenger. It's all of these put together, plus Alexa, Google, plus custom voice assistants. There's an increasing number of channels that conversation designers and teams have to think about. And so how this is being done today is typically organizations are designing for these channels by business line. So they're very much like silos. So often you'll see the sales team may actually go ahead and they might build their own Facebook Messenger bot. They might build their own web chat. Then you're going to have the marketing team. Maybe they're trying to generate more leads and more brand awareness. So they're building their own Alexa skills. Then you've got the mobile team and they're hooking up their SMS flows for their in-product experience. Of course, you've got the call center, which is handling customer queries. And that's going to be done entirely for the IVR system. And all of these different functions are siloed. They're all siloed by the functional business line, even though they're all conversational by nature. And so there are a couple of problems, though, as the number of these channels increase, these non-centralized teams, so sort of the way we've always been doing it, we're going to start to have some problems as we start to scale across these different channels. So one is redundant work. The sales team is not going to know what the marketing team's working on, and they're not going to know what's happening in the call center. And ultimately, you're going to end up having the same onboarding flow, a lot of the same work, just being done over and over again because they're within different silos. The second is you're going to lack brand consistency. You're going to sound completely different on your IVR system than you are on your Alexa skill than you are via your web chat. And so with the siloing, you lack that central design system for conversations that you would if you were to have a centralized team. The third would be knowledge gaps. And so let's say the IVR team finds, they make a major breakthrough and they understand a great new way to do onboarding flows or a great new way to reprompt users. Because everything's being built in a silo, there's going to be a knowledge gap, and that knowledge isn't going to affect the other channels. It's only going to improve that one channel, and you're going to see that asymmetry across all of the different channels, as each of them is going to find out what works and what doesn't, but they're not going to be able to share that knowledge effectively, at least. And then the last is siloed experiences. So for the customer, when I call the IVR system and then I text the Facebook Messenger bot or I talk to my Alexa, these are all going to be completely different experiences. They're going to be siloed. They're not going to remember who I am or have persistence across the channels. And so that's a big problem as well, because again, this is not centralized. These are all being built in silos without any sort of, or at least any sort of major connected contact between the different silos. And so what you're starting to see now is a lot of brands are realizing this, and some of the biggest companies are going ahead and they're starting to centralize their conversational product teams. So that you have IVR, you have Facebook Messenger bots, you have web chat, Alexa and Google. All of these conversational experiences are managed in-house or with an agency, and it's managed in a centralized way where assets are being shared, components are being created. Knowledge gaps, there aren't any. If you find out something that's great about IVR that could be applied elsewhere, it's going to be. And this has a lot of huge, huge advantages. Generally, what this looks like from a structural standpoint is you're going to have these conversational product teams responsible for the creation of conversational AI across all channels. They're going to have a centralized design tool, prototyping tools. Essentially, their tooling set's going to be standard across all these different channels. They're going to have multiple different NLPs and NLUs depending on the channel, and they're going to be able to structure all their work in a way where it can be reusable across channels. Great. Does anyone have any questions so far? I think with webinars, often it's very much sort of a one-way mirror. I'm just sort of talking into a screen here, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them sort of midway through. So I see we've actually got one in Q&A right now. Am, do you want to actually just speak that out? I can't open that right now.
Yep. Which team backend documentation is the best choice? Either Biscuit or Coda Notebook or databases like Airtable, Algora, or Google Sheets?
Yeah, it's documentation's tricky. It depends on. I think the biggest thing is it actually doesn't matter what tool you use. It just matters that you're using a consistent tool. Is probably the thing I'd say. Often people get really hung up on having the pros and cons of each different tool, And so they end up sort of opting for like a multi-tool strategy where they're going to have like Airtable for this and they're going to have like Docs for that. But what ends up happening is even though you're getting the pros and you're getting the pros of each of these tools by using it for its respective pro, you're going to get the massive con, which is you're removing your single source of truth. And so it's often better just to choose a single tool, even though it might not, it might have areas where it's deficient. It's still going to be better than having multiple tools, at least in the process of documentation. That one particular use case, when the single goals have a single source of truth that is able to have collaborative feedback, generally better just to go for consistency. Hopefully that was helpful. Always happy to sort of follow up on that if you've got another question there. Okay, great. So now we've gone over why centralized conversational product teams are becoming more prevalent in the enterprise. Then we can talk about the structure of these teams. So generally, when we think about collaboration at Voiceflow, we typically think about essentially 3 different rings of collaboration. And I've tried to be as not very biased as I do this presentation. So I am using like Adobe XD, PDFs, and Word docs and things. Of course, Voiceflow aims to solve much of this, but I'm trying to keep this very, very non-biased, or unbiased, I should say. So in that first ring of collaboration, you have the actual collaboration, which is typically going to be in tool. And this is kind of like your day-to-day frontline work. So that's going to be your conversation designers. That's going to be your UX researchers, UX designers, and your copywriters. And typically what these folks are doing, and we're going to go into the workflow deeper, but you're typically going to have, let's say, maybe 3 conversation designers and potentially one copywriter. Sometimes the line between copywriter and conversation designer is a little blurred, but the way that we typically think about it, if we were to take the average, is your conversation designers very focused on the logic, so the conversational logic flow, sort of the overall experience, and the copywriters going in there and they're going to nail out perfect prompts. They're going to make sure everything's brand consistent, but they care less about the flow of the conversation. So that's a good way to sort of think about the distinction of that. In the visual world, it'd be very much like your UX designer with a mobile app would be very much like your conversation designer. And then your UI designer, who's actually designing the buttons and the actual elements and assets, they would be much more akin to like a copywriter in conversation design. And so those are your frontline folks. In sort of the next ring of collaboration, that's when you're going to have your developers, your PMs, and really sort of your second ring of stakeholders who have a very clear and direct role in the project. So these folks are typically not going in and using the Word docs and the sheets, the Visio flowcharts and things on a daily basis, but they are going to go in maybe, let's say, weekly, and they're going to give feedback, and they're going to make sure that the frontline work is aligned with the greater team's objective. So whatever that KPI is that they're working towards, whatever that project is they're working towards, they're just making sure that the work's sort of kept on the rails with that second group of stakeholders. And of course, developers, once they get to the end of the project, once we're out of the design phase, then they become frontline and they're actually doing the coding on a daily basis, of course. But often through the design phase, they're much more coming in saying, hey, is this possible? Is this technically feasible? How would this work with the current NLP we're using? That's where the developers come into play. And then that third ring of stakeholders, these folks are typically sort of your broader stakeholder group, where they're not coming in on even a weekly basis. These are much more infrequent touch points where you're showing off very high level designs. So you're not showing in, response variation docs. You're not showing sort of the nitty gritty on how your APIs and things work. It's going to be, here's a very basic flowchart just to convey general ideas. And that's where you're going to use typically like a flowchart. And we're going to get more into the workflow in a little bit here. And so you can think of that, that's typically marketing. They're coming in, they're just going over your prompts to make sure everything's kosher with your brand. That's your executives who want to just know what you're working, what are they investing in? Your clients are coming in. Sometimes they can be more in that second ring of feedback, but very often it's just more, maybe a monthly touch point. And then of course, legal is going to do the same thing as marketing, come in, review prompts, make sure everything's okay. So you have these 3 different sort of concentric circles of collaboration with sort of escalating sort of touch points as you get closer to the center, which is the people who are actually doing the work on a day-to-day basis. I see we've got some questions here. Em, could you read out that Q&A?
Yep. It is a couple different questions. So one is, can we add video to the Canvas markup?
That's a great question. No, we can't right now, but if you have a good use case and sort of rationale for why you'd want to do that, send me an email at braden@voiceflow.com, and I can always you can always have a chat with our product team about it.
The next one is, can we add suggested as-is pricing levels to the marketplace demos, or a session explaining how to formulate skill pricing levels?
So I think for questions that are going to pertain to just more so Voiceflow as a platform and an ecosystem, let's sort of keep those to the end, because I can kind of go off the rails a little bit more and go into some different tangents. For the sake of questions sort of during the presentation, we'll try to keep it fairly related to the content so that we can keep a consistent train of thought. But the one thing I will say is, in terms of price templates and sort of price marketplace things, we've got some more plans coming for marketplace enhancements and improvements coming, and I'm sure M can probably give more detail to that, but we'll save that to the end of the presentation.
Sounds great.
Cool. Okay, so now we've gone over the structure, we've gone over why these teams exist. Let's actually talk about the workflow, and this is going to be the bulk of the presentation. So let's dive right in. So the conversations are really tricky to design because they require multiple dimensions to actually be able to design them effectively. And what I mean by that is, unlike visual design, where you can typically just patchwork together a couple of visual screens, you're going to have your animations and things in there, but for the most part, you can get 90% of the way of understanding a conversation with only sort of visual screens. Conversations, just given their nature, it's really difficult to get a full view of the conversation without sort of giving way too much context or way too little context. And so typically you use a variety of different tools to add different dimensions, so you get sort of different flavors of the conversation. I'm getting a call, I'm going to turn that off. Sorry about that. And so you typically add together these different tools to be able to get these different flavors of the conversation. So the three most common is going to be your sample dialogues, your flowcharts, and your sheets. Typically, when you look at sample dialogues, these are being used to wireframe the conversation, and they're really just meant to give a very basic overview of the objectives of the conversation. And so you can imagine when you're actually going ahead and you're doing your sample dialogues, these are really, really good at sharing. When you're just in the very earliest ideation phases, you just want to give someone an idea of what you're trying to build, what the objective is. But from there, once you want to add a little bit more high fidelity and you're not just doing the happy path, you're going to start to run into problems of context. Well, what happens if the user says this? How do we know that, how do we know what the context flow of the conversation is? What happens if it's the user's second session versus their first session? You could ultimately, if you wanted to, write out 1,000 different sample dialogues and have each of them be state-based, but that would be really, really tedious. And so that's typically where we move on to flowcharts. And what flowcharts are really good at is sharing the scope of the conversation. So when you're sharing with a stakeholder, being able to say, here's the conversation flow. They're going to order a pizza here. It's going to bring them the payment flow here. If they don't want to order the pizza, it's going to bring them over here. It's really good at showing all the different paths and the different contexts of the conversation. However, and we're going to go into an example right after this, where flowcharts start to fall down, though, is they don't have a very good way of showing depth of the conversation and response variation. So a good example of this would be when you're ordering a pizza. On our flowchart, we may just have a little box that says order pizza, and when we're sharing that with high-level executives and stakeholders, that's great. That's all they need to know. We have ordered a pizza in this one little step. But as everyone knows, when you actually call a pizza place and you're ordering a pizza, there can be 5 or 10 dialogues within that small little box. It's not a very simple process. There's lots of reprompts and error handlings and things like that. And so we need to think as designers, okay, well, how do we only give the context that's relevant to our stakeholders? And that's where flowcharts are really good, because they give the super high level, the scope, but they don't give any depth. They don't give sort of the nuances and almost like the day-to-day of the conversation. And that's where we go to sheets. Sheets are really, really good at saying, if it's the user's first session and it's nighttime and it's this and this and this, then say this. and if we have this response, then we're going to have these, 10 different response variations to back it up. And so it allows you to add a lot of conversation depth. But of course, when you're looking at a spreadsheet, it's really hard to actually conceptualize the conversation, and it's incredibly hard to understand context. How does this conversation piece together in a logical flow? It's really, really hard with sheets. And so typically what happens is that's where you pair up your flowcharts with your sheets, and you've got your sample dialogues as a reference for sort of high level objectives. So these three tools together give you enough different dimensions of the conversation to be able to give you depth and scope. Anyone have any questions on that? Em, I don't know if you can see if there's any QAs there.
No questions about that specifically, but there is one in regards to collaboration with clients. Oh, actually, another one just came in as well. So one kind of spoke about how do you use prototyping tools in collaboration with clients and executives? And then the second one are there any examples in regards to what you just spoke about?
Yeah, it's a great. So I'll answer the latter first. I've got a couple examples right after this to go over the differences between depth and scope. So we'll sort of go into the nuances there. In regards to prototyping with clients, it's a great question. So when creating prototypes with conversations, it's really important that you lay out the context for the client. So what are you trying to prototype, right? So there's high fidelity prototypes and there's low fidelity prototypes. High fidelity prototypes is you've basically built the whole experience. And that's actually where a tool or Voiceflow is quite good, is you can create something that's incredibly high fidelity. It's basically the end product. And you can just share that with your stakeholder or your client in this case, and they're gonna be able to give really sort of in-depth feedback. But creating those prototypes that's super high fidelity, it's got all the response variation, all the error handling in there, that can take a lot of time. And so when you're prototyping with clients, it's important to set the expectations of what you are prototyping. Is this just the happy path? Is this just this one particular flow? Like often what we do in Voiceflow actually is we will give, using Canvas markup, we'll put our sample dialogues for the particular happy path that we're testing with the prototype. We'll just put that right on the canvas so people know what to say and what they're testing. And it kind of gives them guardrails a little bit. That's often something I do when I'm doing demos, is I've only built out one happy path. I'm doing a demo with a big customer, and there's 15 different intents that this app could eventually handle, but I've only had time, as this is just a demo, to do one flow. And what I'll actually do is I'll say, look, like here's how this would be structured, and here's how you would expand this. I've only done the happy path, and here's the actual sample dialogues right on the canvas, so that you can just go ahead and run through that conversation and sort of have that script in front of you just to test how that feels. That's how I generally approach it. And then of course, like the more you take the guide rails off the prototype, the more the prototype's gonna have to be higher fidelity. It's gonna have to have more functionality built into it to be able to handle more unstructured conversation. Yeah, if there's time at the end, I'd be happy to show some examples of what that looks like when I'm doing demos. Cool. Okay, so running through here, examples of scope versus depth. So this is a Voiceflow prototype that I built. This one's just to show off context and things, but for the sake of this, what I want to zoom in on is right here, you have the order pizza intent. And so of course, this is fairly readable to most stakeholders. And of course, you could add Canvas markup and things to make this even more readable. But it's like, welcome to Voiceflow Pizza, name, how can I help? The user orders the pizza. Once they've ordered the pizza, we're going to go great. We're going to say the order confirmation. So, is this correct? If they say yes, payment flow, and your order has been placed. A stakeholder could get that in their email, and in 30 seconds, they could understand the gist of what you're actually trying to convey. And so this is conveying the scope of the conversation. We're able to see that there's an order confirmation path and a cancel order path. I've got a store hours command over here. Okay, great. I understand the scope of the conversation, but there's no depth, right? Because if I was actually ordering a pizza, this isn't just going to be a one-liner. There's going to be a lot of response variety in there. And so what that actually looks like is in Voiceflow. If you open up my order pizza intent, I've got 3 different types of slots I need. I need size, type, and method. And then we have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It looks like response variations. Depending on if the user just gives us size, then we're gonna have to ask for type and method. If they give us all 3, we're gonna go right through. If they give us none of them, we're gonna have to ask for one at a time. If they give us just size and method, we're going to have to ask for type. The reason that this is hidden away, though, in an editor is when you're collaborating with stakeholders, this isn't relevant information, right? Like, if I'm designing with another conversation designer, they can go in and they can leave comments and they can understand the depth of the conversation. But for the most part, when we're looking at like a very top level view of the conversation, the only thing that's relevant to us is the flow of how are we getting to our objective with the user? How are we pushing the conversation forward? And let's not worry about error handling and sort of reprompt states and things like that. And so that's a good example of how Voiceflow hides depth in favor of scope, but you are able to then go in and have that spreadsheet-like functionality. Another quick example of that is even in this, like, how can we help? You can see I have a little icon here for, I'm giving up multiple varieties of responses. I've got like 3 different responses. Like, how can we help? What can I get for you? What we have today? Again, not relevant to stakeholders at all. We don't want to show like a crazy, loop-de-loop of, randomly choose one of these 3 responses and then, that leads back. It's just, it's not contextually relevant to stakeholders. And so we've tried to hide some of that depth in Voiceflow to, again, just give you the scope, or you can go in and go to the depth. And ultimately, I think that's what makes a good conversation design, prototyping, and build tool, is being able to toggle the different dimensions of the conversation, so that when you can give a high level view, you're able to do so. And then you can also zoom in and you get that conversation depth as well. Anyone have any questions there?
Nope, we're all good.
Cool. Alrighty, so when it comes to the actual tools that make up the workflow, because conversations for the last 20 years now have been designed using essentially those three different tools that I talked about originally, which is your Word docs, which is going to be like your wireframe. You've got your spreadsheets, which is going to be akin to your response variation and your conversation depth. And then you're going to have your flowcharts, which is giving you your conversation scope and width. But the problem with this is, of course, none of these tools are custom built for voice or conversations, I should say. And so what ends up happening is these are all makeshift tools that are piecework together or patchwork together. And as I'm sure there's a lot of sort of professional conversation designers watching right now, you feel the pain of, you change up your flowchart, and then the sample dialogues need to be updated, or your response variations need to be changed. And none of these are all talking with each other. So it ends up just becoming a very waterfall process. And then prototyping becomes a really big issue. Because if you have developer resources on your team, that's great. You're able to actually code up the prototype and code up some basic happy paths and things. Still requires maybe a week or so to get that prototype up and running. A lot of teams have internal tools that are sort of like makeshift voice flows to try to make this process easier. But often folks are just introducing WAS testing really early on, which is great when you're doing sample dialogues. But as you go to, as you start prototyping low fidelity, which is like a Wizard of Oz, but you want to get to the high fidelity prototypes, there's a gap there because you can't do that without some sort of automated test or some sort of custom coded prototype to get the full experience. Another problem, of course, is doing manual testing just doesn't scale very well. I can't just send out a URL and have 50 people respond like they would a survey. Instead, I actually have to hop on a Zoom call with 50 people. It's a little bit of small talk at the beginning, walk them through what they're going to do, and then actually run that call, and then do that 50 more times. And so it's not very scalable to actually do prototyping and user testing well. And then finally, when it comes to the actual handoff from designers to the developers, generally it's just handing off Word docs and Excel sheets and a flowchart. And what that leads to is the developers have to interpret, well, what's the actual coded app going to look like? And so you end up having a ton of iteration in between the design and dev just to get to that first version where you can start building off, because there isn't a strong communication between designers and developers towards exactly what is needed and required that designers are asking for. And so this whole process, we've seen it can take 2 months to 2 years, depending on the scope of the project, and it can just be a really big burden having to use all these makeshift tools. So of course I had to do a Voiceflow plug at some point. Tools like Voiceflow do streamline this process. I won't go into it too much, but I'm sure many of you are already Voiceflow users, and you can try out this stuff for yourself. One big thing is a single source of truth. So being able to have a single workspace where all of your teams work. So again, being able to have your design team, your developers on there, your external stakeholders, everyone's able to have one shared workspace where we can give feedback. I've got a quick screenshot here to show what feedback looks like in Voiceflow. This is commenting, which is a new feature which should be coming out fairly soon, which is very exciting. So being able to have stakeholders come in, leave comments directly on the canvas, they're all multi-threaded, really, really exciting. And of course, we also have hyperlinks with Canvas markup as well, so you can link to external documents. Reason I want to show these off is, not only a Voiceflow plug, but also the different ways in which the workflow can be augmented. Just because we've been using Word docs, Excel sheets, and flowcharts for 20 years now doesn't mean that has to be the way. And especially as intent-driven conversation design becomes more and more apparent versus traditional like DTFM and touch tone, having more dynamic tools is going to become really, really important. Great. So that was the majority of the presentation on workflow. I've got one quick note, which is the emergence of full stack solutions. I think is a really interesting sort of industry trend we're seeing. And so what this pertains to is you're seeing a lot of tools emerge now, which are trying to be essentially everything for everyone. And so it's trying to be the design tool, the developer tool, the actual production tool, and as well as the analytics tool, and it also has the NLP and the NLU and the ASR, all that stuff's baked into it. And so I think these are really interesting, but I generally think of them as emerging because it's very early in the market. And so typically with a product workflow, you design, you prototype, you build, you manage, and you analyze. And if you look at mobile or web, you're actually going to have one product that does each of these really, really well, because ultimately you have to make product trade-offs. As you all know, being product people, product is a process of trade-offs between pros and cons of making a feature. The more features you add, the more complex the tool is. The least features you have, the easier it is to use. You're making trade-offs. So when it comes to web, you're going to have your Figma or your Sketch for your design. Then you're going to have InVision for prototyping. Then you're going to have your favorite IDE and your favorite web frameworks, and then you're going to have like Segment and Amplitude for analytics. You have a best-in-class product for each part of the product workflow. And the reason you're doing this is web is incredibly competitive. There are millions and billions of websites that you have to compete with, and so you need to have the best tools in each part of the workflow to be able to compete effectively. I think right now, though, we have an emerging market situation with conversational AI, and so there aren't billions of bots that you're competing with. There's maybe hundreds of thousands to millions. And so for a lot of businesses, this also isn't core business yet. This is very much sort of an innovation experiment where they have low investment because the market potential is low. If we were at a point where this was core business, it had high market potential, then they're going to have a high investment. It's going to sort of correspond and grow linearly. And so I think where these full stack solutions are really good right now is it allows you to have the low investment because the market potential is low. But I think over time, you're going to start to see the market segment further and further where tools sort of falling into particular parts of the workflow as it becomes more and more competitive and each tool has to specialize. Just a bit of my personal thesis on where the market's heading from a tooling perspective. It's all forced by the market dynamics. Cool. Okay, so that was the presentation. We went over why centralized product teams are emerging for conversational AI. We went over the structure of these conversational product teams, copywriters versus conversation designers, the different layers of the collaborative workflow. We dove deep into the workflow, so talking about why we have the tools that we have today, what some of the challenges are with sort of using these makeshift tools. And ultimately, we also talked a little bit about Voiceflow and sort of what we're trying to do and work towards. And at the end, we talked a little bit about full stack solutions. So I'd be happy to field any questions you have. I will be around.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Braden. I'm going to take over the screen, and then that way you'll get access to all of the Q&A. All right. Do you see the Q&A section, Braden?
I can, yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. So first, we have who can help startup voice agencies with voice skill marketing and sales? Yeah, I mean, voice is tough. Tough to start as an agency, because for the most part, a lot of brands are unsure of the ROI, and so I think the most important thing when you're starting an agency that's specialized in voice is focusing on a couple of use cases. So, like, great use cases we see with customers all the time is entertainment space. You're going to see podcasting. You're going to see interactive videos and things like that. We've got a great skill, the New York Times, built on Voiceflow. That's their 6-minute news quiz, or no, it's 6-minute workout. Use cases like that are really strong in entertainment. Moving into the custom assistant side, you've got in-car assistants, which are really strong. You've got drive-through assistants, which are really strong. You've got banking apps, of course, which are doing really well. There's lots of sort of interesting use cases. So I would suggest you focus on a use case. Question from Dominic. So, do you see Voiceflow as the only design tool, or would you also recommend it in production without programming it on ASK Jovo? It's the latter. Up to which scale do you recommend Voiceflow in production? That's a great question. So, Dominic, more and more, the way we're viewing Voiceflow is segmenting it to 2 different customer bases. And we have our creators, and these are folks who their goal is to actually go ahead and publish fully to production. And so the features that they care about is integrations, like further API integrations to add more power. It's native platform functionality, so things like Alexa Conversations, APLA, Amazon Pay. On the Google side, interactive canvas, cards, carousels, all that kind of stuff. So that's one customer segment. And that's a very large part of Voiceflow's customer base today. And then we have the other customer segment, which is, we would describe them as like the conversation design professionals. And the things that they care about is like collaboration, better design features, being able to zoom in and out of scope and depth, sort of some of the features I was going off there. And so we view Voiceflow as able to do both. And the reason that we feel that is, I think conversation design, and I know our head of product, Rob, did a great presentation on this. Conversation design, like the actual design artifact, is often best as a prototype. So unlike visual design, where the actual design and the prototype are 2 different things, in conversation design, to really understand the design, it kind of needs to be a prototype. And so that's the way that we've sort of viewed the space. And in that sense, like the high fidelity prototype is so close to the actual build production that we feel we can sort of successfully cater to both customer segments. And so that's what we've been doing so far. And you're going to see increasingly, it's going to become increasingly clear in the coming months that we're going to support both of these different use cases and really start to segment them out. So creators are getting the features they need, and pros are getting the features they need. And we're doing that successfully. And we'd love your feedback on it too. In terms of what scale would you recommend Voiceflow in production? We power almost 1 million messages a day, so around quite a bit. And so it's able to scale. We've got a great cloud infrastructure team. We power apps for a couple of Fortune 500 companies at this point. And so whether you use this for design or prototyping or in production, that's up to you. And ultimately, we're able to scale to billions of conversations. Great. Hopefully, I answered your question. Adam, what are your thoughts on extending the connections between Sketch and Voiceflow? For example, being able to export flows from Voiceflow and use them as vector objects in Sketch for visualizations. Yeah, this is something we're thinking about quite a bit. Is what I would say is our goal in Voiceflow. We had a visual tool that we sort of built as a prototype. I'd say maybe like 5 or 6 months ago, and we ultimately decided that you're not going to build visuals in Voiceflow. Like, we don't have the resources as a small company to rebuild Figma and Sketch and things like that. And so instead, it's going to be a lot of import focus for sure. And so building relationships with other companies to be able to do things like that. That's something we're thinking about for sure. I can't say about timelines or sort of what concretely we're going to do, but we're thinking about it. Cool. We've got Zhao. How would one share an early prototype with the client that needs to validate the conversation scripts? The client needs to be added as a Flow collaborator. Can she be added in a viewer tier? Yeah, so Voiceflow's viewers are free. They're not included in billing. And so what's great about this is for workspaces that are on the pro tier, you're going to get, if you got canvas markup, you're going to have commenting coming very soon. And so you're going to be able to add in, even if you only have like 1 or 2 licenses for pro, you're going to be able to add in 50 different stakeholders if you'd like to, and they'll be able to come in, try out the prototypes, view the designs, and also leave feedback with comments. And so that's sort of the direction we're moving towards, and you should see that release in the next couple of weeks. Great. Okay, so just make sure I didn't miss anything here. I think that's all the questions. So if anyone has anything further, let me know. But otherwise, you can reach me at braden@voiceflow.com. And okay, we got one more question here. If you were to build a new conversational voice team from the ground up, which would be the first 3 roles you would hire, and which background should they have? That's a great question. So you're definitely going to want to have a conversation designer, and I typically think that coming from a linguistics background is going to be best. Reason for that is conversation design, there's a lot of best practices that people don't think about. A lot of folks, they assume just because they know how to, they know how to speak, like I know how to speak English, or I know how to speak in general, therefore I can write a conversation because I know how to have a conversation. But there are so many sort of underpinnings to what our brains are doing, and sort of the structures that we use that we don't even realize we're using. That's really important that you actually have that conversation designer with a bit of a linguist background, so that they can structure the conversation in a way that feels more natural. It's really hard to actually describe best practices, but it's kind of like one of those things where you know it when you see it. A great example would be the exact same conversation. Like, let's say we're asking the user to pick a color. We want them to either pick red, blue, or green. 2 ways to do this. One is going to be a closed prompt, and one's going to be an open prompt. We're going to say, hey, welcome to Voiceflow Colors. Like what kind of color do you want? That's an open prompt, and they can say red, blue, or green. But if they don't say one of those 3, then we're going to narrow the scope of the conversation and be like, hey, like, sorry, we don't have purple right now, but do you want red, blue, or green? All right, so we're narrowing it down versus a closed conversation where it's going to be, welcome to Voiceflow Colors, please choose red, blue, or green. And so small things like that, depending on the conversation, they make a big difference when you sort of add them up. So hopefully that was helpful. Conversation designer with a linguist background be first. I'd probably introduce a copywriter and then a developer. Like those are going to be your three roles. Copywriters coming from just generally a sort of copywriting background. I don't think the education background matters as much there, but it's knowing how to concisely write in a way that reflects your brand values, so that you're able to be on brand and consistent and things like that. And then the developer, generally just having an understanding of what's possible from a technical standpoint, because conversation design is so closely meshed with the actual underlying technology. Because it's not like visual design where everything's possible because you're just pushing pixels around. With voice and conversations, it's dependent very much on the NLP that you're sort of sitting on top of. So having an understanding of that underlying framework is really important. And I think that's where the developer comes in. Plus coding early prototypes and things if you're not lucky enough to use Voiceflow. Cool. Anyone have any other questions? If not, yeah, you can reach me at braden@voiceflow.com. You can join the Voiceflow community group and add me on LinkedIn. Oh, okay. One last one here. How do you balance the need for having UI designers working side by side with conversation designers? It's a great question. When it comes to voice first design, it's tough because the most organizations are visual first. Like Voiceflow, like we've got great designers, like UI designers, and people always try to default to visual first. But it's really important that the conversation designer they're actually leading the development of the interaction between the user and the interface when you're doing multimodal displays. And the reason for that is you need the conversation designer to dictate to the UI designer what needs to be made for this to be a great conversation. And the reason for that is if you let the UI designer and the conversation designer work in tandem, it's going to end up being a visual first experience with sort of some voice prompts and things to go between screens. But what ends up happening then is it sort of becomes a crutch that you rely on the screens. And so it's really important that the conversation designer goes first. They're the project lead. They're leading the project. They are coming from a UX background, with a little bit of a linguist background, and they're designing the most constrained experience first. As I'm sure a lot of you guys know, when you're designing, you always want to design for the most constrained experience. So for example, with mobile and web, there's a reason that companies that went mobile first beat out companies that went web to mobile, because you'll want to design for the most constrained experience. So in the sort of order of priority, that's going to be voice to voice is the most constrained. Then you're probably going to have chat comes next. And then after that, you're going to have like voice first. And so that's going to be, it's going to be really important that you're able to design the conversation in a way where the conversation dictates what's on the screen, not the screen dictates what the conversation is. So hopefully that answered your question. You know, the TLDR, so the cliff notes of that answer would be, make sure it's the conversation designer who's actually dictating the flow of the interaction, because otherwise it's going to be UI led and it's not going to be a great experience. Cool. Alrighty. So, without sort of waiting for any further questions, then feel free to email me, Braden@voiceflow.com. More than happy to help. I'm also on LinkedIn as well, Braden Ream. And yeah, always happy to hear your feedback. Oh, and for folks who are asking if we can put APL video on the canvas, just send me an email with a reason why, and I can forward that to our product team. We always want to make sure we're building something that people actually need. Cool.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much, Braden. So I guess you kind of left with a lot of parting wisdom, but as you mentioned, there's tons of different ways that you can get in touch with us. We'd love to hear your feedback, especially since there's a ton of stuff that came out with Alexa recently. So if you have any suggestions or anything that you'd love to see, please feel free to email us or contact us in the community group. And for more ways that you can get involved or more things that are coming up, we have another Fix It Hour with Nico coming up tomorrow, where we'll dive into a little bit more on what's going on with the new Alexa functionality that's come out and how you can take advantage of that. We also have a virtual conference and a workshop that's happening at the Voice event next Friday, which is a half-day event featuring a bunch of different leaders in the space, and we'll be closing off. So definitely come check that out if you'd like to. And last but not least, in August, we have two webinars that have yet to be scheduled, but you might want to keep your eye out for because they're very interesting. One's going to be on building using APLA, which is APL for audio. And this is outlining how Creativity Inc. was able to create a multimodal experience using Voiceflow and Alexa's newest functionality. And we'll also be doing a session on IVR and going from chat to voice. So if you're interested in those, definitely subscribe at our voiceflow.com/events, and you'll get that straight to your inbox. And if you're not already part of it, definitely check out our community. This is where we post all of our newest upcoming updates as well as events. And if you want to be the first to know about anything, this is the place to be. So thank you again, everybody, for joining. And don't forget to check out voiceflow.com/events for this recording, as well as all upcoming events for next month. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.